Welcome to another special webinar with Legatics. Today, what we're going to be talking about is adoption and implementation of legal tech, not so much for buying and the sort of looking through the market and doing market analysis and picking the products you want, more about once you've actually got them through the front door, what happens next. What are the challenges? What are the KPIs to look for? What are the success stories and so forth? And with us is a fantastic panel. So I'll start off with the hosts, which is Dan Porus. Hi, Dan, from Legatics. And we'll do quick intros. I'll just intro everybody, and then we'll do intros for everybody. We've got Shruti Ajitsaria, who is head of Fuse at Allen Overy, the global law firm. And if you're reading Artificial Lawyer as you eat your toast and watch this, you may see there's a special profile of Shruti this morning. And we've got Cem Uçan, who is at Baker McKenzie, and you're based in Turkey, but you have a sort of more international and global role as well, I believe.
Yep, that's correct.
All right. Well, okay, let's go back the way around. So, Cem, do you want to start off? Just a quick intro about yourself.
Absolutely. I joined the firm a number of years ago. Before becoming an innovation product manager, I used to be a timekeeper in Istanbul office. I did compliance, white collar investigations, antitrust. But at some point, I realized that there could be more to legal than just practicing law. So I switched over to the legal technology side, and ever since then, I've been trying to help our lawyers go home a bit early, hopefully with a bit more money.
Wow, what's an interesting point. We'll have to come back to that. Does tech help lawyers go home early? To be discussed. Shruti?
Hello. Do I need to introduce myself, or can everyone just read your article, Richard?
Everyone read Shruti's article right now.
Or I could introduce myself. So I'm Shruti Ajitsaria. I am a partner at Allen Overy in our London office. I am formerly a derivatives lawyer, but have now spent 5 years in Fuse, which is our tech innovation hub.
Fantastic, thank you. And Dan, just to wrap up.
Sure. So yeah, Daniel Porus. I am the Chief Commercial Officer at Legatics. I'm also a former lawyer, so practiced M&A for about 6 years and have been with Legatics for the past 5 years, rolling out our transaction management software. So have seen the evolution over the last few years, getting adoption going with firms like the two that we have on the webinar today.
Fantastic, thanks, Dan. And as mentioned, the subject is adoption and implementation. So we'll chat about a few things, and then it'd be great to hear some questions from the audience. I guess we'll probably go for about 30+ minutes or so, and then I guess we'll get a signal from the team to open up to questions. So if you have any questions, just keep them in mind, and we'll come back to them. So let's kick off with a baseline. And this may sound like an obvious question, but I think it probably needs to be asked just for clarity. As a law firm, is it a very different process between going out and buying a product and implementing it? I mean, are they very, very drastically different things?
Well, obviously, when you buy a product, you think everyone's going to use it. You don't buy it because you think it's not going to be utilized. But in terms of the implementation, I mean, there is just, I think before I started Fuse, in my mind, I was quite naive about what that entails and all the various different steps that you have to go through to sort of, and rather than just talking about a sort of a narrow version of implementation, I mean, like, imagine I've bought a license with Legatics. How do I get from that to having the number of people within my firm who I would like to be using Legatics use it? Like, what does that journey look like? And there is a lot to be done. And some of it is around the plumbing and safe utilization and thinking about, do my lawyers really want to have to sign into multiple different things? How are we going to train them on something new? How are we going to remind them every time they open a matter which could use Legatics that it's there available for their use? How are we going to track that the time that they save is actually worth the price of the license? So there's actually a number of different things that you have to do. And as I say, I think when I started doing this, I was quite naive about what that actually entailed. And it's only kind of, it's taken me quite a long time to realize that it's not as simple as, oh, I really like that nice shiny thing, we'll buy a license. Like, that's kind of like the beginning, and that's almost the easy bit. The harder bit is seeing it through and encouraging people to change the habits of a lifetime. Point number one, ensuring that the way in which something has been added to the tech stack that you have is easy for people to access, and thirdly, ensuring that they have the support that they need to be able to use it with confidence.
Good start. Okay, there's a lot there. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but clearly,
Yeah, there is a lot, Richard. Who knew?
Yeah, who knew? Who knew? We should do a webinar on this. Cem, for you, so at Baker's, how completely separate are those two things? The buying and the you've got it through the door. Now, what do we do with it?
Yeah, I think the buying part is actually the easiest part. If I had to grade that in terms of efforts, I would say that's one effort to get it through the door. And mind you, that we actually, but we put our vendor's face through the mud. We have them take all the tests, all the different security assessments and everything. And after all that, I think the actual adoption part, pushing out that innovation, is actually about 10 times in terms of effort. And there's a lot of patience and a lot of time investment that goes into it as well, because it's not an organic process. Well, it is an organic process, but it takes a very wide time frame in order to achieve a significant adoption level. And if you don't guide that process, it can take ages and it could just flop because there could be some barriers that you are not really spotting along the course. So I think the amount of data diving, the amount of interviews that you have to do, the amount of data that you have to collect once you get it through the door is just an immense effort, at least in my opinion. So I think I would grade them as 1 to 10 in terms of effort, but that's just my take.
Okay, interesting. And we're going to delve deeper into those points. Dan, for you as a provider of software, I mean, do you feel that distinct difference? You've been in for meetings, you've probably done multiple demos and so forth, and suddenly you're actually going to be used. And does everything kind of change?
Yeah, I think just to draw on the initial point that you asked, I think I've seen an interesting evolution just over the last 5 years in terms of how the process of buying and then implementing technology has changed. I think we found sort of back in 2016, 2017, when we were first going to market with Legatics, there was a much wider prevalence of just, a partner within the firm would get very excited about a solution, bring it in, and then it was like, oh crap, how are we actually going to implement this thing? And there was no coordination around it. Increasingly now we are finding that it's much more structured. There are innovation teams, there are people who are properly assessing the solution, and much more of the thinking about what's actually going to happen after we bring the solution in, and how are we going to make sure we actually get some return on investment on this, and it doesn't just sit idle on the shelf. So have definitely seen that. In terms of the different stakeholders, it does vary still from firm to firm. Some are a little bit more separate in terms of those who are bringing it in will step away, or certainly parts of the people who are involved in that initial process will step away. But increasingly, there are the same people who are bringing in the solution, certainly in the innovation teams, that will be involved with the initial implementation. And what we've found with a number of firms is that there's a further transition as a vendor. Once we become business as usual as a solution, we get transitioned to a separate team, the sort of more business as usual technology. So there's that initial phase of getting used, getting adopted. And I think a really important part for us is understanding how the firm works and operates, who are the key stakeholders that you need to get on board, both for the initial buying journey, but then afterwards as well, when it comes to implementation and adoption as well.
Gotcha. So yeah, three stages really there. Interesting. We'll come back to that in a moment as well. But one question that I'm sure some people are asking is, how can this process be so, I don't know, divided, you might say, that if a law firm wants to buy something, how come it doesn't just, why isn't, you might say the implementation process, why isn't that kind of all ready to go? So, the firm decides we need a deal management platform to help with us. They figure out what they're going to need to implement it. They go and choose one, they buy it, and so forth. And why isn't it seamless? Is it because they're buying tech first and then figuring out how to implement it? Is that, it's got to,
Richard, if I can offer an observation, which
Mhm.
is, but before I opened Fuse, we at A&O very rarely dealt with companies that were slightly smaller and slightly less experienced, and perhaps with whom we had to collaborate to meet certain requirements, or with whom we had to collaborate to share our training or support expectations, or with whom we had to collaborate on the product, right? So this is actually a relatively new journey for law firms, which is working hand in hand with third parties, and rather than having that sort of traditional arm's length vendor sort of relationship where you're sort of, okay, fine, cool, give me this thing and I'm going to put you through this cookie cutter tunnel. Actually, almost every product that we've onboarded at Allen Overy is slightly different and comes with its own set of challenges and issues. So sometimes it's that we're working with a very small team that doesn't have the bandwidth to do certain things. Sometimes we're dealing with a product that doesn't meet our information security requirements. How do we help them get there, and how do we help them understand what those are? Sometimes we might pilot something within a part of Allen Overy, and it turns out that in fact those lawyers aren't particularly receptive to it, but a different group might be. And I think, if you were just to have one very simple, seamless route, I'm not actually sure that you would end up with better results. It might be less frustrating in the actual journey, but I'm not, if we just only had one, right, you come into the funnel here and you'll either pop out at the end with great adoption, or you'll pop out at the end and no one will be using you and we'll just have to drop you. I don't think that would be a great result. So, I think it requires, and the thing I felt about Fuse from the get-go is it requires a much more bespoke approach. Every single different company is going to need something slightly different from us. We're going to need something slightly different from each of them. We need to understand them. They need to understand us. And, along that way, you'll figure out how to make it work best for people. And also don't forget, something like Legatics, actually it's used in some parts of our business, but not all, right? So in litigation, for example, we don't really use Legatics, but so we can't just sort of be like, okay, we'll put you all through like one single thing, because actually we have other litigation tech which isn't used by other parts of the business. It's not ever that simple, and I think that's right.
No, it makes sense. Actually, one question I was going to ask later, but I think now's a good moment for it, is that, it seems to me that there are different requirements for different types of tech. I mean, for example, let's say you're updating to a new version of Westlaw, or, Westlaw has just produced some new wingdings that it's added to its research capabilities. It's not going to be, I presume, a huge job to bring that aboard and update it and implement it and so forth, whereas you bring on some machine learning tool that's actually going to alter the way the lawyers work. It may alter some of their business plans and so forth. That's going to be a really big piece of work because you're changing behaviors, whereas other tech, you might say like legal research, the behaviors are already set. I mean, Cem, do you feel that if you're bringing aboard something quite new, something that's potentially disruptive in a positive way, that you have to think about it differently?
Absolutely. And that's a part of the challenge. But coming back to the initial question, I think the difficulty with the law firms is that we are not FMCG. We are essentially processing information, and in order to do that successfully, you have to allow partners and associates a certain degree of freedom in what they do, and that entails using legal technology or not. If there was a clean chain of command like you would see in an FMCG company, we would probably not be having this discussion, because the adoption of legal technology, or any technology in that matter, wouldn't be voluntary or optional, but in our case it is. And coming to your question now, there are a few different factors that we go through as we are assessing whether or not a legal technology will have an easy time diffusing through our community. So one of them is relative advantage of the legal technology, but also coming to your, if it's something entirely new and different, how is it working in terms of complexity, and how is it working in terms of compatibility with what lawyers are doing? If it's very complex and difficult to get a hang of, I think that, so we look for the aha moment when you actually use a product and see that it's doing something that's generating a lot of value to you. The faster you can get to that moment, it's actually easier for the lawyer to decide on whether or not to adopt it. So that's a part of the level of complexity of it and the level of trialability for it. For example, take Legatics. It's a great tool to manage transactions, but it actually takes a whole team to adopt it in order to actually be used in a live client manner. So that kind of takes away from its trialability. But if you use it on your own, just setting up a matter, it's actually very easy to get started setting up a matter, just perhaps using it as a document management system. It's very easy to see how useful it could be to generate that peace of mind for the attorney. So there are a number of different factors. The decision of innovation adoption, whether it's optional or whether it's you have to do it on a mandatory basis, all of these things factor into how we would be going about pushing that specific legal technology. So for example, we would have Legatics, which would be kind of optional if you would like to use it. But then we would have different technology that you have to use for example, massive due diligence reviews. So, I guess it's all coming back to how bespoke this has to be.
Yeah, well, you made some really good points there. I mean, I was just talking to some people yesterday about tech adoption, and they were saying that they actually almost force their lawyers to use certain products. They've decided, effectively you will be using this, and they just keep reminding them constantly. In other cases, not. But Dan, let's just go to you, and then we'll go back round again. So, what does success look like, and when do you kind of get an inkling that this is working, this is coming together?
I think success is an interesting question when it comes to rollout and adoption, because it does mean different things to different people. I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to actually using the tool that you've brought in. But success, the reality is, if you bring in a tool like Legatics, you're not going to operationalize it and use it on every single deal in your firm on day one. So part of it is actually breaking it down and thinking, what's this going to look like over the course of the next year? What's it going to look like over the longer term? And I think it's about, imagining big, but really starting small. And it comes down to, winning over individual hearts and minds and sort of getting adoption going there. But we sit down with the firms and we do actually ask that question: what does success look like for you in the first year? And for some, it might literally be as simple as, we just want our lawyers to say that this is better than the status quo. We want to get positive feedback from our clients that they've had a good experience, using the technology over the course of this year. To the point that Cem mentioned at the beginning, maybe getting to go home at 6 p.m. at night as opposed to 2 a.m. in the morning on a deal, that might be success for them. So I think success is a difficult question in that way. I think it does vary from firm to firm, and it does vary over time as well. Ultimately, you want to be getting to a point where you're getting a return on investment from the use of the technology that you're bringing in, and it is increasingly becoming used. But it does vary significantly in my experience.
So Shruti, how for you on the user buyer side, how do you discern that something is a success? If you just get a couple of partners using it over 12 months, is that a failure, or are numbers not the key factor here? Is it something else? I mean, how do you know that something's working?
Do you mind if I go back to something Daniel said first before I answer that question?
Yeah,
which is in our case, just in case it's helpful, because Daniel and I were on this journey together with Allen Overy, and as you were speaking about how something sort of takes off in a firm, it's one of the kind of most cool things I've ever really seen at A&O was we had a partner, David Campbell, who really loved the product, was really behind it. He used it on a deal. He had great feedback, spoke to his friends about it. All of a sudden we had a transaction. I think it was, Daniel, do you remember? Was it in Abu Dhabi? I think one of his partners in Abu Dhabi, from what I remember, used it on a transaction. That was like great. And it was really a hearts and minds exercise. And now Legatics really does feel like business as usual in A&O, but that didn't come from the top, as I think Cem was saying. That's totally different approach. You know, it really came from feedback from partner peers. And I suppose the other observation I would make around enforcing use of legal tech is who would be the person that could do that? You know, who is empowered within a law firm to say, you must use Legatics on every banking transaction that happens? You know, it'd be maybe the global head of banking, but it's quite a difficult thing to enforce. So I'd say, you know, but there are also, you know, just the reality of a law firm is there's many fiefdoms, and actually what will tend to happen is an associate will tend to use legal tech if there is partner buy-in from the partner on the deal. And aside that, I'd say there is no sort of enforced use of legal tech, but if a partner on your transaction says, okay, we are not going to do this a manual way, we have committed to the client that we're going to do it another way, or, you know, you are going to have a better time if you do it this way, or I would like to try this, then that will be the thing that sort of moves you from not using to using. So my experience of kind of enforced use of legal tech is it's not really a thing. And the biggest difference actually is hearts and minds of partners, and getting the partners to give the associates the bandwidth to go and investigate what they can use, maybe do the training, take the risk, because also no associate wants to try something and feel like they're going to have to explain to their partner why it's all gone terribly wrong when it was their choice and they've had to take responsibility for it. So it's just, sorry, just a bit of thought on a couple of the points that we've raised. I don't know, Daniel, Cem,
it's very, I think it's very organic. You can't impose these things.
Maybe to elaborate on that as well, Shruti, because I think something that went really well at Allen Overy in the early days, just around that whole winning the hearts and minds, is, you know, those partners, they got so excited about it, they got going, and as it happened within Allen Overy, they happened to be dispersed in a number of different geographies, a number of different, you know, jurisdictions, and that successful early usage, they really became the champions of the product. And they then, you know, the word spreads, they talk to their other peers, they get going on a transaction, and it goes beyond actually just championing as well. Something that Allen Overy did incredibly well early on was it wasn't just lip service. The partners would turn up to the trainings, they would stand up at the beginning of the training and they'd actually say, here's this fantastic new piece of technology, you know, I've used that on, you know, I've just used it on a transaction, and I'd really encourage you to find the opportunity to use it. And that really empowered the, you know, that really empowered the lawyers, the ones who are going to be finding the opportunities to use it on upcoming transactions to get going. And you do, I think it's been interesting because we were talking about success in those early days, but you get that momentum that builds, and it has got to a point now. We've got two you know, firms on the call today who have got to a point now where it is very much business as usual within, you know, certain teams and certain practice areas within the firm. But I think the point is, it starts small. You don't from day one get to fully operationalizing, you know, most technology that you bring in.
Well, it looks like Cem's dropped out temporarily. We'll bring you back in a moment. But go back to Shruti. Okay. Shruti, I mean, just on that point about, you know, internal communication, I mean, how does that work? I mean, particularly in a very, very large law firm, you know, like A&O, where you're literally across multiple time zones. You've got offices from Australia to, you know, San Francisco and everything in between. How does that information sort of get disseminated? Do you sort of write internal marketing emails saying, you know, such and such a partner would like to talk to you about this wonderful experience they've had with X product, you know, or do you just hope that, you know, they meet each other on a phone call or a Zoom call and spread the word that way?
I mean, I will throw the kitchen sink at adoption, because I think, you know, something like the intranet, I am guilty of literally never looking at it. So I have no idea what's on our intranet. So if I were to rely on that alone, I don't think, you know, we would get a sector of the Allen Overy society. Something like partner informal champions. And the thing that I really liked about it, Dan, to your point around the champions, is it was completely informal. It wasn't that we like gave anyone, like, you know, we didn't have a prefix badge, or, you know, sometimes you decide, okay, we're going to launch this cool thing and we're going to have champions, and you know, the champions are basically anyone who's vaguely, I don't know, held an iPad in their hand and sort of shown any enthusiasm about tech, or maybe listened to a podcast once. You know, we didn't have that. We had genuine enthusiasts and genuine people who loved the product, and so therefore in the partners dining room was sort of like, oh yeah, cool, in the same way as they're sort of like batting around the gossip. And also separately, I use Legatics, it's quite cool, you should give it a go, and that worked really well for us. But we use a real range of methods. I'm happy to try anything, to be honest, and you have to be cognizant of the fact that the trainees are looking in a different place for their information to the associates, to the partners. The people in the London office might, look at a sign in the canteen, but let's not forget, as to your point, that we're a global law firm and we need to get our way across the globe. So we used to do a really cool thing where we'd do pop-ups, and we would go to our offices. I think Dan and I have been to a few together. Dan, did we go to Frankfurt? Where did we go running? It was Frankfurt, wasn't it?
It was Frankfurt, yeah.
I was training for the half marathon, and Dan took pity on me and took me out for a run, and like very kindly went like the slowest he's ever been in his life. But we went to our office and sort of physically showed our lawyers there so that they could have sort of a good experience, a close experience. They could meet the founders, they could have a chat, they could try the products, and it wasn't just sort of like an article on the intranet that they weren't particularly interested in. So we use a real range of methods.
Interesting. Well, let's. I mean, I was going to ask Cem that, but let's move forward because we've got a lot to cover. Let's look at some of the challenges, and let's go to Cem first on this. So, when you do get pushback, or I guess in some ways amongst lawyers, you won't necessarily get pushback. You'll just get this kind of stony lack of interest. They won't like throw things, off their desk or anything. You'll just get this kind of, oh, I didn't read that, or I didn't see that, or no, we didn't use it, and end the conversation type thing. I mean, how do you deal with what, I guess for you, what are the top 2 or 3 challenges, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we call that passive resistance. They're not doing anything, they're not actively adopting, they're just doing what they do, and they don't want to take any risk or do anything different. That's a good indication that you are speaking to the wrong person, and you should stop wasting your time and energy speaking to that person. That is not the person that you will be able to get adoption. So my take on key challenges is, for me personally, it was my own ignorance, because I was trying to push legal innovation since 2017, I would like to say. And at first I was speaking to everyone, trying to get everyone to adopt innovation. And we hear that all the time as well. People say, I've been trying to speak to everyone, it's not getting any organic adoption. I think this is a bad product, or we should, quit trying to push it. That's actually not the mechanism to use. There are beautiful books out there that actually go to lengths about how network theory or diffusion of innovation. There's a book about crossing the chasm. Hacking growth is another one. They all talk about how you can actually be adopting. You can have others adopt innovation, but this mechanism works for basically everything. If you would like to transmit an ideology, a religious system, legal tech, it doesn't really matter. All of them actually follow the same human mechanism. And there was a question about whether the legal tech adoption is different in the UK or Europe. No, it's not, because we are all humans and we actually have very similar cognitive biases and risk-averse approaches. We have all evolved in pretty much in the same way. So I would say the biggest challenge was for me to understand that we were doing it wrong. So the key to successful adoption is understanding what you would like to do with it first. So if you would like to get exposure, newsletter and training, but that's not going to get you any adoption. For adoption, you need to identify your early adopters and innovators. This is about 15% of the population, but that's actually what you would like to target is about 2.5% of any population. Though they would be the innovators, the people who really, once looking at Legatics, they would just fall in love with it and would like to try different things with it. These would also be the people that hack the system, and instead of, for example, using it for banking and finance, use it for antitrust or compliance investigations. That's a good sign that this person is an innovator. The good thing about innovators, they all know each other. So you only need to tap one of them to actually bring alive a whole network of individuals that you did not know before. So once you get through to them, you provide access, education, training to them. You try to accommodate their enhancement requests as much as possible, because these are the people that you have to win over so that they will actually go ahead and win you the next portion of the community, which is early adopters, people who see potential when they look at a product, people who can actually, innovators are kind of, they are geeks in a certain way, and I'm one of them, I suppose. They just like to play with it. Early adopters can actually see the potential, the commercial value, and stop and start implementing that into their day-to-day, which is great. You need that because that gives you pragmatists and then conservatives. So I think that was, yeah.
Focus on the early adopters, but going back to an earlier point, and I'll put this to Shruti, is again, it kind of strikes me like, if you can identify the people who are open-minded about new tech, who are willing to challenge how they operate, the innovators in effect, can't you corral them, figure out what are the visceral needs they have, and then go to your tech stack, see what you already have, perhaps it's already there, and if it's not there, then you go out and you search and you do some market analysis. I mean, wouldn't that be easier than bringing stuff in and then holding it under different people's noses? And like,
can I ask you a question, Richard, which is, 10 years ago when you used to order a cab, what did you do?
Say again?
10 years ago when you used to order a cab, what did you do?
No, so you've got, I know what you're trying to say. You're trying to break, you're trying to break into new types of behavior that they're not prepared.
No, I'm not. I'm trying to say, I'm actually, what did you do when you used to order a cab 10 years ago?
What did you stand on the street? Yeah.
Well, if you were trying to order a taxi, you'd ring up your local taxi company, and you'd say, do you have availability? Can you take me to the airport or whatever? If someone had said to you, what do you need from this process? Could you have inherently have known that you would find an app, in which you could choose 3 different types of cars, which was going to arrive within 5 minutes? Given that, I mean, it's such a difference from what you were used to seeing.
I know what you're saying. It's the faster horses analogy. Henry Ford, leaves his factory, crosses over a river, finds a farmer in his field, and says, "What would you like? How can I help you?" And he goes, "Well, I'd just like a faster horse, please. I don't want one of these big mechanical monsters you're making."
And we're there, I think, Richard. Sort of that's what the problem is I can go around all day long asking my lawyers what they want and what they find difficult. I'm not actually sure. Before they saw Legatics, if I'd have gone around and said to people, what's annoying to you about Allen Overy in terms of our use of technology, 99% of what we would have complained about, I suspect, would have been the document management system and filing documents and filing emails. I really don't think there would have been that many people that said, "Ooh, the conditions precedent process in which I am creating a table is incredibly complicated. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a platform, by the way, which I've never seen in my life, which could automatically extract the list of the conditions precedent from the Word document itself, stick it into a table?" Like, it does things that our lawyers never dreamt possible, would never have thought up, didn't know could be made easier. Daniel, can you just please congratulate me on the fact that I still know your pride inside out, and even after all these years. But I think we're just not there. We're not at a place where we can go around asking people and expect them to have an intelligent answer. Occasionally they do, and occasionally people come across things. And if you think about it, that is how Legatics came about. It came about through one lawyer's frustration and a problem he had decided to solve. But those people are few and far between. And actually, Anthony's a really interesting person because he doesn't just have a legal background. He actually comes from a STEM background. So he looks at things differently to the majority of us who maybe have studied law at university and have got no idea what the art of the possible is. So I just don't think, don't think we're there yet.
I know I half agree and half don't agree. It's kind of like, I think that, and particularly now that a lot of lawyers do know much more about what is possible. I mean, I think certainly when you were starting, I can see that absolutely. It was just like, it's like an unknown. You can't even like point to it because you don't know it exists. But I thought now, particularly with Fuse operating at A&O, people do have an inkling that certain things are possible, or they might dare.
Well, they have an inkling of the things that they see being possible, but every single year, this year we've got a company in that looks at drafting and collaborating in Word documents and in documents and doing away with versioning. And truly, before I saw the demo, I wouldn't have really thought oh, versioning, that's a problem. Gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could get through life without versioning? It's so ingrained in me that it would never have occurred to me that there was a different way. And I think every year we find something new that's pushing at the boundaries and doing something new. And sure, our lawyers see that thing and they think that thing is great, but we still have a lot of different verticals to cover. So I just don't think and what we struggle with sometimes is something like Legatics is very easy to use because it's really clear. Here's the use case. Here's what you can do. Here's it's very simple. Actually, sometimes what we struggle with a bit more, and Cem, interested to hear your views, but sometimes where we have like a technology that's a bit more agnostic, so you're sort of saying, here's something that can, for you it can do this, for you it can do this, for you it can do this. You've just got to put a bit of thought into how you're going to do it. Our lawyers really struggle because we're not taught to, and we don't inherently often have the skills to make a leap from X to Y, because that is not what you learn at law school. And as a lawyer, 99% of your job is around kind of like minimizing risk and basing life on precedents. So I mean, Cem, what's your experience?
Yeah, so my experience, can you hear me all right? I think awesome. I think you will hate my opinion because I have the privilege of, I have the comfort of letting market handle, take care of itself. I can just sit back, relax, and let different companies take each other over, or one market leader to come to light. And I have the luxury to wait for that, because once a specific product is good enough, it's usually going to cover all the jurisdictions that I need to cover. And if it's being a massive player, I don't have to I don't have to go and get the best product, the newest product in the market. I can wait for the best product, the most complete product that has price to performance curve that I can be okay with. So I don't even have to go and do that, which is my luxury.
But I guess, Cem, I guess what that's interesting. I guess the additional point is, do you feel that you should be going out there and sourcing these needs? And I guess Shruti's point was that the lawyers just don't know what's possible. So
absolutely,
even if you canvass all the M&A partners, they won't tell you what they need because they won't know what's possible.
And it's great to listen to your customers to appreciate their pain points. But I don't have the talent or the skill set or the resources to carry out enough interviews to actually put together. I can put together a list of requirements that my business need, but then I don't have the resources to go and build that or look for that in the market proactively. You can always try that, but what we have is matured portfolios. Actually, I mean, most of the firms listening would have something that cover, for example, collaboration or automation. So you already have something in your hands, and attorneys often have a better time looking at what they have and what they would like to have on top of that. It's a lot more easier to put into concrete terms what that gap is. And if you do market research towards the end of your renewal cycle, you're all set.
Interesting. Well, I think what this exposes is I think there's obviously room for the innovation strategy inside law firms to grow, because to me it seems like a huge waste of effort to not be able to do at least some internal sourcing. Even if you can't get an absolutely accurate answer, I mean, it sounds like there needs to be some internal training around what's possible, because at the end of the day, you're wasting a lot of time holding stuff under people's noses and trying to figure out if they're going to use it. If you could identify a little bit earlier, and I agree with Shruti, generally, they don't know what's possible, so it's hard to do that. But there has to be some movement more in that direction, particularly as the market matures, because otherwise it's perpetually going to be buy something, test it, does it work, does it not work? It just seems like a very laborious process. I don't know. But let's move on. There's a good question here. I was going to do questions at the end, but a few questions are trickling in. Catriona asks, what happens if a lawyer has a bad experience of a product? And I think I've seen this happen with startups where they're really not ready, really, and it may be even in a bit of a sandbox environment, but some of the lawyers involved don't understand that the product isn't perfect. They have a bad experience, and then boom, that's it. that company's name is mud inside that law firm. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you deal, I guess two parts. How do you deal with a partner or influential person in the firm who says, I hate this product? And you're like, ooh, that's bad. And the second point is, how do you, some of these startups are not finished products. I mean, every week I do an interview with a startup, and it's clear that the product is not a finished product in many cases. There's bits to finish, but you want to get it out into the firm and to be used. How do you handle expectations, and how do you handle, unhappy partners?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cem, go for it.
Yeah. So to the partner that says, I hate this product, it's a good idea to do, if possible, a debriefing to understand exactly what went wrong. It could be just, lack of training, which could, actually indicate different problems, or our workflow wasn't correct, or it wasn't fleshed out enough. These are all great examples of what could be going wrong. And once you identify the problem, you can then actually start taking corrective or preventive actions, which is great. But more often than not, you get this bad reputation, and it's very difficult to walk back from that. We actually had a similar experience, and what we did was we changed the formula around that product, how you use it, what resources are provided when you're using it. So we changed the whole value stream around the product to actually make it so that we would put in a fail-safe place, and it would be very, very difficult to get a wrong result with it. But that was a very specific product, and when you are dealing with a not finished product, someone has to onboard a product that has not been completed. But if you have tens of offices, thousands of lawyers, I think for law firms it's great to experiment with legal tech, but then again, you have to be careful about what you are paying and what you are getting, especially at these sizes, because our lawyers, there was a question about that as well. They just don't have the time, especially transactional lawyers are, especially they are sleep deprived. So it would not be a good time or place for them to experiment with any legal technology.
Well, exactly. You can just imagine an absolutely exhausted partner feels that they want to do something helpful, offers to test a product, misunderstands that it's not a finished product, uses it, gets very angry with it, and goes, my God, you've just wasted a ton of time. So Shruti, I mean, Fuse is in many ways an experimental place. In some ways, you could say. I mean, how do you handle the diffusion of products that perhaps are not absolutely finished?
I mean, you asked two separate questions, and I might just address the first one first, which is, what do you do when someone doesn't like a product? And almost part of Fuse is to try and unearth that early. So typically we will pilot something, give it a go, get feedback, try and ask around, get as much information. And just because something's coming to Fuse, it doesn't mean that we want to use it. It means that we want to investigate whether our lawyers are going to like it. That's almost exactly the job. And so I don't feel any sense of pressure when a company comes into Fuse to make my lawyers like it or to push it on them, because that's totally beside the point. The actual point is to say to them, do you like it? If you don't like it, cool, no worries, that's perfect, we've learned something, this is not for us. And that is our mechanism really for figuring that out. So we try and do that piece of work early on, and we try and elicit the answers direct from the lawyers, because what I didn't like about the process before was I felt that I never got asked about anything, and then all of a sudden something would land on my computer and I would be expected to use it. So that's kind of exactly what we're trying to get away from. On the not finished piece, I think I hope that there is sufficient of an understanding amongst our lawyers that Fuse is a testing ground, and we do take in companies earlier than sometimes other law firms might, or we originally would have done, and with that comes the requirement to be a bit patient. And I think, as long as, to be honest, what we require is that the vendors are honest with us about what where the problems lie. Because if you're not honest with me, I can't be honest with my lawyers. And then if it turns out that you've broken someone's word or made their computer crash, or oopsie daisy, it hasn't pulled everything across from A to B because there's a glitch and we knew about it, but we chose not to tell you, I can't help you, right? But if you tell me up front, these are the problems, then we can communicate those to our lawyers and say, use this, give it a go, just so that you're aware they're still figuring out this bit. And then you have a line. I think it's just about aligning expectations, and we can only do that if the vendors are 100% honest with us. But we know where they are. We align expectations, and we ensure that people know where the issues are and know what's being worked on, and actually have the opportunity to feed back into it, so that where things are changing, that's done with actual feedback from actual real lawyers who are actually using the product.
Well,
Dan, you sound like you're about to add to that.
Well, yeah, go on. I think amazingly we're running.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly give the I suppose vendor perspective on that. Something that we've seen is obviously the power of the positive network effect and positive kind of referral when things go well. But the reality is, if something goes badly, it's actually compounded worse. Word can spread quickly about the bad experience and not going well. Something that we, thankfully for us, it's mostly been the former and very little of the latter. But when you are constantly exploring new potential use cases, the reality is, to your point, or the point that's been mentioned, it's not a finished product in that regard. And as much as you explain that at the outset, expectations for the lawyers may be different about what a solution can do. What we've found has been really effective when things don't go quite according to plan is to really take the time to sit down with the person who was affected to understand what went wrong, note it down. And it's so powerful when a change has then been made to the product that actually deals with the issue that arose, related to what caused the concern, to go back and actually show how the product has evolved, to take that into account and make it better. So that's something that we have just found when you are on the fringes exploring new use cases, for example, and something hasn't gone exactly according to plan, how it can almost be used as a positive as opposed to the negative.
Well, we've got to wrap up shortly. We've got about 15 minutes left. So just a couple of key questions, and we've pretty much covered it in some way, but let's just go back to it, which is what does a good relationship between a vendor and a law firm look like, particularly at this early stage of adoption? What does that relationship look like? Cem? What are you expecting from your, are you expecting the tech company just to hand over the software and disappear? Do you want them to be in the building every week? Do you want what kind of relationship do you want?
Absolutely. And sorry, I was muted again. So I would say data is what we need starting off. As an ongoing relationship as well, because data can give me information about what my lawyers are actually doing on the platform, which could give me a good idea about what they may be needing, what different use cases are coming out of that, which would give me insight to actually target or retarget some of the different populations that I haven't tapped at yet. The second one, and I think Shruti talked about that as well, and as well as then, you need to have enhancements, and you need to see that those enhancements are getting delivered on a hopefully quick pace, because that's actually allowing you to build a lot of trust that you can later use as your credit with timekeepers, as well as between timekeepers and yourself, and between timekeepers and the product. When they are providing feedback, they're actually investing time that they don't have any rational reason of investing in a product when they're providing that feedback. So it's great when we can come back to them and actually provide a proof that we have been listening and we have been delivering on that specific need. There's also the element of reducing any barriers when new people are trialing out the platform. You have to reduce any potential barriers to entry into that specific platform so that more people can come into it. I'm sure there are a number of different elements, but I would say trust also has to be accounted among one of them. If things are not going well with the production, development cycle, let us know, because that actually gives us, we have to manage our stakeholders. And if you are open to us, we can be open with them, which is coming back to the trust point.
Okay, useful, good stuff. Shruti, let's move on to a different subject, which is KPIs. And we've talked a bit about, Cem, I guess, has kind of highlighted this already. What do you actually look for KPIs, and what kind of KPIs do you look for when you're onboarding a product? I mean, do you get into the sort of nitty-gritty financial stuff? Is it just about satisfaction? Is it numbers? What do you even go as far as talking to the clients who may have engaged on the periphery with that product? I mean, what are the KPIs for you?
It's a really difficult question to answer because it entirely depends on the product. And what you're hoping to achieve by using it. So, that again, sort of, I never have one single set of KPIs because that's not appropriate. But if you just, given that this is a Legatics webinar, if you imagine something like Legatics, the sorts of KPIs I'd be looking for are usage and adoption within, not, obviously I think the mistake people sometimes make is like, oh gosh, well, all of our lawyers should be using it. That's actually not appropriate. It's not correct. Usage and adoption within the appropriate cohort of people. So for us, more often than not, I'm looking at, the junior lawyers who are in the banking department or maybe in the corporate department. But, you've got to get your cohort right to get your KPIs right. Look at feedback, so qualitative feedback. Do people like it? Do they think it's faster? It's quite difficult to measure the efficiency because you need to be able to look at a deal before and deal after and see, and it's very difficult to take two deals and say, well, this replicates this is the same, and you can do some sort of guesswork, but that's, I think, a lot harder to do accurately. We do take client feedback into account. Did a client prefer a deal we were ran with Legatics versus one without? So there's quite a lot that will go into the bucket, and as I say, it will really depend on the product. And part of the difficulty of it is, I think Cem mentioned data. Some of the difficulty is around getting the right reporting, in place. So not just who has signed up for the license, not just who has been trained, but who is using it. And if you're using it, that you need the context. So for example, if you're having 10 platforms set up in a week, is that a good number or a bad number? Well, it entirely depends on the number of deals that are being done that were in the funnel for potentially, potential use of the Legatics. And if it turns out that, certain clients you couldn't have used Legatics on due to their information security requirements and engagement terms with us, then they come out of the funnel. So it's actually not a very simple question to answer. And it's always a moving target because you understand more about the product and the potential uses as you kind of go through, and then they change. Legatics started off with us just in the banking department, now it's in our corporate department, so you sort of have to start the whole thing again.
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I'm becoming less and less convinced by ROI, which I should probably set out in an article, but not here. Got a few minutes left. I've just been prodded to make sure that we've definitely answered the question around is adoption different in different countries. Cem, you talked a bit about, you basically said it was universal, but just to clarify, let's go back to Dan, because obviously you're selling into other countries. When you're selling to places outside the UK, the US, or Europe, and obviously every European country is very, very different, as I know. I've lived in a couple. Is it very different?
The answer is yes and no. we saw themes emerge with the countries in Europe that were more open-minded when it came to technology, but interestingly, that hasn't always converted into the most successful adoption within those same places. So the other thing that we've actually realized as it's become more and more business as usual is it kind of comes down to that point before. It comes down to individuals within different firms. And although there are certain geographies where we've seen greater adoption of Legatics, for some firms, their Madrid office will be, getting really fantastic adoption. For others, the German offices have actually been, really good. But I wouldn't say, while there are some patterns that we see around overall usage, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily one or the other. We have seen the most usage in the UK, and I think part of that has just been that's where we started, that's where a lot of the initial deals, and I think that's just a maturity point. We are seeing adoption grow globally, as firms, operationalize the use of Legatics, and it does continue. So that is my yes and no. I wouldn't say there are these particular countries that do it.
And I guess it varies on, as you're saying, partner by partner. But just out of interest, I mean, is there any country where you've just had a straight no? People have just looked at it and just gone, "What the hell is this?" And no, you must be kidding us,
Not a straight no. We have had some countries which are a bit more. They don't want to be necessarily the first mover, and they want to move together as like a group of firms. And so you sort of end up speaking to a number. They're speaking to each other, and they sort of want to move together. So we've seen that happen over the over the last year, and there are a few countries that I put in that bucket at the moment when it comes to transaction management, where they're very interested, but they're all sort of moving together. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think the sort of collaboration amongst the firms to get that going is good. But I think that comes down to a collaboration point. I think everyone gets, just from a Legatics perspective, that this is better than the status quo. It's just a question of the sort of the when and the how.
It's interesting actually how much of this comes down to communication, both internally, externally, and intra-market. It's fascinating. I'll have to do another webinar on that. Coming towards officially anyway, I don't know if we can keep going, but officially we end in about 5 minutes, and we've actually answered quite a few questions as we've gone along, which is quite nice. Let's finish off then with some takeaways. We'll start off with Shruti and then Cem, get back to Daniel to finish. If someone's listening, a law firm or even in-house, and they're still getting to grips with onboarding tech, what sort of key takeaways would you suggest for them?
I mean, I have always been of the opinion that you just need to give things a go, right? Just, even if it requires you to do a relatively small pilot, and it's quite a lot of work to get there. I think if you don't actually try stuff, it's really hard to progress.
So just as you said, I think you said on stage at Legal Innovators, be 10% more brave.
Be 10%. It's a good point, actually. Yeah, be 10% more brave.
Like it, absolutely. Cem, what would you say?
My takeaway sentence would be focus on early adopters and innovators, and stop wasting resources on people that you cannot convince. They can only be convinced by people they trust, who have to be early adopters or innovators. There's no value to be gained by speaking to a pragmatist or a skeptic. That would be my take. Because that lesson actually, it could, like, if I knew that earlier, that would have saved me like 3-4 years.
Wow, so it's quite significant. So basically, the moral of the story is don't try and evangelize people who are completely skeptical or just don't want to engage.
Yeah,
it's just
the way you actually bring them on board to the product, is you actually surround them with the people who actually use that product. At about 40% mark, they flip over and start using the product without you ever having to speak with them.
Okay, no, indeed. Dan, you get to finish off and you get to answer the last question, which is, okay, so adopters, great. How do you identify these early adopters? And to that, if you can, in just 2 minutes, what are your key recommendations? So
I can answer that question with my takeaway, because it's actually the same, and it ultimately comes down to genuine collaboration. You need the ability to sit down between vendor and the law firm and really listen to each other. So I think there's an opportunity for the vendor to share what's worked well with rollouts at other firms, but on the other hand, to really listen to the firm and understand what's the culture of that firm. How do they actually, what initiatives just aren't going to work due to cultural or structural nuances within the organization? What do they just not want to do? Some firms, we've actually got examples on today's webinar of 2 different firms who have managed to do really well with operationalizing Legatics to the point where it's business as usual within certain departments and certain practice areas, but with 2 very different, in a number of ways, approaches to adoption. And a big part of that has been genuine collaboration, and looking at where we as Legatics can support the firm, and where the firm can feed back to us the things that really work. And part of that collaboration enables you to help identify where you can find some of those early adopters, so we can share where we're seeing increased adoption, which practice areas, which use cases. We can share which geographies we've actually seen an uptick in usage, and maybe they can explore trying to find users who could use the product there. So that would be my takeaway, which hopefully answers the question as well.
And thank you. And interestingly, I think it all comes back down to the same point, which has recurred again and again today, which is communication. Just keep talking, talk widely, talk broadly, deeply to everybody, and then you'll find out who's a supporter. And then once you get started, adoption will spread, and then it will also be easier, I guess, to figure out the KPIs, because you'll have a body of people that you can really draw upon, rather than trying to sort of fish around to try and construct artificially a set of KPIs. So look, fantastic. We've hit 10:30. We've got to move on, unfortunately. But thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for your great questions. All that's left for me to do is say thank you on behalf of myself, Richard Tromans, founder of Artificial Law, Daniel Porus of Legatics, which is the company which has very kindly sponsored and supported this webinar, Shruti Ajitsaria from Fuse at Allen Overy, and last is Cem at Baker McKenzie. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.